maybe, hopefully. We have a big day of a lot of fun things planned for you. We have some wonderful speakers that have donated their time to really educate you guys on the kids, and I hope you guys really enjoy it. I know some of the BHC staff here moved up and everything, but if a lot of you that are in the back might kind of migrate a little bit more to the front, that way everybody, participates and is seeing and all that. So while we do this, I'm going to tell you about our first speaker. Dr. Rhodes is a man of character. He is, let me get all this right, a board-certified psychiatrist. That is right, ladies and gentlemen. He will help you with your children. He's great. The children love him. He takes time with the families. When you see him, he's walking the kids and the families and talking to everybody. But Dr. Rhodes works there at BHC, and he has so many awards. You guys can read them all on there. I was going to read them off to you, but I'm pretty sure everybody can read, right? But I did want to tell you a little kind of story about Dr. Rhodes. He was conducting a group therapy session the other day for some moms and children, young moms and children. And do you remember that, Dr. Rhodes? Oh, he's not. I'll remind him what happened. So during this group meeting, he looked at the moms and said, "You all have obsessions." To the first mom he looked at and said, "Well, you're obsessed with eating. You've even named your daughter Candy." And the mom just kind of looked like, "What?" Next lady he looked at and said, "Your obsession is with money. You named your daughter Penny." Well, he kept going around the room. The third young mom, he looked at her and observed and said, "Your obsession is with alcohol. This too shows itself in your child's name, Brandy." Well, about that time, the fourth woman got up, grabbed her kid by the hand and said, "Come on, Richard, we're out of here." And I'll leave it at that. So please welcome Dr. Rhodes.
Tech? Nope. Maybe. Let me turn that down a little bit. If I can figure out the volume. Is that too loud? Okay. I don't know how I'm going to top that. So, especially with the subject material I'm going to talk about, which is childhood trauma. It's hard to find the humor in that, but we'll get through it. So, I titled the talk today, Childhood Trauma Under the Surface. And the reason I did that is, if we think about it on a societal level, not a lot of people who are outside of our fields understand how prevalent this is. And it's under the surface of a lot of problems in society. In our clinics, in schools, it's under the surface of a lot of problematic behaviors of kids you see. We have patients that present with depression, anxiety. A lot of times trauma is under the surface. And so everyone, by being here, you understand those two things. I thought one thing I could add is talk about the biology. What happens to your body during trauma? What's under the surface? Because we treat trauma every day, and I think it's important to know a little bit about what occurs. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay. So I'm going to give it the definition of trauma. You have to actually be exposed to an actual threat, threatened death, exposed to serious injury or sexual violence. It requires a direct exposure. So hearing about a traumatic event on the radio or TV, that it doesn't qualify. But if you hear about trauma to a family member or a close friend, that can count as a traumatic experience. And when we think about trauma, each trauma is different. So this is not a homogeneous population of people. So go to the next slide. So I'm going to briefly talk about PTSD, just because I feel like in a trauma talk you should at least talk about it a little bit, but I'm not going to focus on it too much. The term PTSD was coined in 1980 with the DSM-3. Prior to that, it was given different names. It was originally called shell shock after World War I. And in the DSM, there are basically 4 clusters of symptoms that have to come together to get the diagnosis, and you have to have intrusive re-experiencing, a physiological arousal, which is what we're going to talk about mostly today, avoidance behavior, and negative alterations in mood and cognitions. Now, DSM has what's called Polythetic Criteria, which is like the Chinese menu you order off of, 2 for this, 3 for this. Like for PTSD, the intrusive symptoms, you have to have 1 of 5, and then you go through like that. And for kids, it's basically the same diagnostic criteria. If a kid is 6 or less, it's slightly different, but it's pretty much the same. And then some people would argue we shouldn't put the word disorder on PTSD because what's the normal reaction supposed to be, to this? So the reaction is actually protective in the short term, and we'll talk about that. But we'll move to the next slide. Worldwide, diagnosed PTSD, about 4%. It's a little bit higher in the US, and is that because we live in a society that exposes people to more trauma? That could be argued. It's probably because we recognize it better. That's why our rates are higher. But interestingly, what's more interesting is the female-to-male ratio. You can see the lifetime prevalence for women's 8.5%. Males, it's about 3.5%. And I'm actually going to put people on the spot and see if anyone has any ideas why that might be the case. Go for it. That's good. I never thought about that, but that's possible. And if we go to I like that one, but go to the next slide. Did we do it? Yes, okay. So women are basically exposed to the types of traumatic events that are more likely to lead to PTSD. Rape, domestic violence, things of that sort. And if you look there on the risk of developing PTSD after each of these types of traumas, it's actually remarkably low. Like if you look at rape victims, if we do longitudinal studies, about 19% will meet criteria for PTSD, but that means 4 in 5 don't. And that's kind of hopeful. We're a resilient species, but that's trying to see the bright side of such a dark subject. But PTSD is actually an unlikely outcome of trauma, even though 80% of people are exposed to some traumatic event in their life. Go to the next slide. Okay, so the reason this is important, too, is because trauma kills. It's not just in the short term a traumatic event happens and you die, but over time, it shortens one's life. There was a study that was done in the mid-'90s. It started in 1995, and they asked a population of people, 17,000 people, to report the incidence of what they called adverse childhood experiences. And then they monitored those 17,000 people for the next 11 years. And of those 17,000, 1,500 people died. And then they wanted to see, okay, how are the adverse childhood experiences correlated with age of death? And what they found is, compared to people who had no adverse childhood experiences, people who had 6 or more, which is a lot, they died on average 20 years sooner than people who had never experienced trauma. If you had 6 or more adverse childhood experiences, you were like 1.7 times more likely to die before the age of 75, and 2.5 times more likely to die before the age of 65. So trauma shortens lives. In 20 years, that's significant. We know in schizophrenia research that folks with schizophrenia die 25 to 30 years earlier. Well, so do people who are extensively traumatized. Go to the next slide. So when we talk about death, the term is mortality. We know that traumatic experiences increase mortality. They also cause illness, and we call that morbidity. And trauma has been associated with everything from poor dental health to GI complaints to diabetes, even autoimmune disorders, heart disease, the gamut. If you look at the correlations between trauma and health outcomes, it's pretty dramatic. Go to the next slide. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is, if we just want to summarize the talk right now and be done, is talking about how the body, what the body does during fight or flight response, why we do it, and how activating that so frequently is bad for the body. It's protective in the short term, but it kills us in the long term. So, now I'm going to ask, does anyone recognize these characters in this picture? Anyone? Okay, we got someone. We got two people. Okay, either of you? They're from The Big Lebowski. Okay. Now, do you know their names? The people that know the movie. The dude, who's the other guy? What'd you say? Don't remember. No remembering? All right, his name's Walter. All right, and if only 3 people have seen The Big Lebowski, do yourself a favor and go watch it. It's one of my favorite movies. But I put that on there because after you watch the movie, you'll see these guys characterize the fight or flight response. The dude is the ultimate relaxed guy. He will flee from situations, where Walter is just a raging maniac and he'll fight. So you two, I brought a bowling pin, and no one will understand what this is, but you can come get your bowling pin since you raised your, yeah, you can have it. Everyone else is lost as to why I'm doing this, but you get it. All right, go to the next slide. All right, so here's where I'm going to start using medical jargon, so stop me if I need to repeat myself. But to understand trauma, we have to understand different systems in our body, and the one that's been most studied is called the Limbic, Hypothalamic, Pituitary, Adrenal axis, which I'm going to refer to as the LHPA going forward, because I don't want to say all those terms. And I put a picture of Simba on here because in The Lion King, Simba had this very traumatic experience when his father died, and he just filled him with rage throughout until he wanted to kill his uncle, right? And so that show kind of shows how early adverse events can affect behavior later on in life. So go to the next slide. So in the LHPA, limbic, hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis, we need to talk about each individual component. So try to stay awake with me here. We're going to talk about a little bit of anatomy. The limbic system is a part of our brain. There are several different structures in it. Different resources will debate which structures, but everyone agrees the amygdala and the hippocampus are the 2 main portions of the limbic system. And the limbic system is involved in regulating feeding, reproduction, caring for our young, and for today's talk, the fight or flight response. The hippocampus is, think of this, it's involved in memory formation, and your hippocampus associates memories with sensations. So everyone has smelled something and it brought back memories. That's kind of, the hippocampus is involved in that. And then the amygdala, it attaches emotions to our memories, and especially fearful memories. So those are in our central nervous system, and they connect with, go to the next slide, the hypothalamus. This is a busy slide, I apologize. But what the hypothalamus is, it is the part of our body that connects our nervous system to our endocrine system, which makes hormones. So it receives input from the brain, the central nervous system, and the body, the peripheral nervous system, and then it secretes hormones to the pituitary gland to tell the pituitary gland what to do. So the hippocampus releases, it's called releasing hormones, and they help to do many things in the body, regulate body temperature, blood pressure, hunger, thirst, mood, sex drive, sleep, lots of things. Go to the next slide. So these are some of the hormones that are released. You don't have to worry about most of them because they're not relevant to our talk. The two most important that I'll talk about a lot are corticotropin releasing hormone. I may also call it corticotropin releasing factor. So if I say CRH and CRF interchangeably, I apologize. And then it also releases dopamine. And here you can see where the hypothalamus is in the brain. It's a very little structure right above the pituitary gland. So go to the next slide. And then here's the pituitary gland. So there are two parts of the pituitary gland. There's the part in the back, the posterior pituitary gland. The hypothalamus connects to that via nerves, and that is in the couple things it releases. It releases something called vasopressin, which regulates salt in your blood, sodium in your blood. And for today's talk, more importantly, the posterior portion of the pituitary gland releases oxytocin, which is involved in bonding, breastfeeding, labor. So go to the next slide. The anterior pituitary gland has many functions. We won't go through all of them. The most important one for today's talk is it releases something called ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, and it does that in response to the CRF. So the hypothalamus makes the CRF, tells the pituitary gland make ACTH. Go to the next slide, please. That ACTH then goes to little glands that sit on top of our kidneys called the adrenal glands. There are two parts, the middle part and the outer part. The middle part releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. Another name for epinephrine is adrenaline, and it comes from the word adrenal, from the adrenal gland. And then the outer portion releases cortisol, which is what we'll talk about mostly today. Okay? Go to the next slide, please. And this sort of summarizes what goes on in the LHPA axis. Our limbic system tells our hypothalamus what to do, what's going on, I should say, and then the hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland, hey, you need to do this. Pituitary gland releases ACTH, and then our adrenal glands will release cortisol. So go to the next slide, please. So normally, when we're exposed to a traumatic event, we have this fight or flight response, and then it goes away. A lot of the people we see, it never goes away. It happens over and over and over, and that impairs normal physiology. So what we see is when someone's traumatized, CRF rises immediately and releases quite a bit of cortisol and ACTH. However, the body can't handle that stress response for so long. It's not good. When we have a fight or flight response, we divert blood to our muscles, and we do it away from other processes in the brain. So, for instance, when the fight or flight goes off, the front of our brain kind of shuts down a little bit, and we don't plan and think. We just survive, and that's not good. So, what the body does is it starts making less of the CRF receptors in the brain and the pituitary gland. So CRF goes up in our traumatized patients, and it stays there. And if you measure CRF in patients who are traumatized throughout life, they're going to have higher levels. And to deal with that, they make less receptors for the CRH. Another thing, in your brain, there are CRH receptors that, when they're activated, can cause symptoms of anxiety and depression. So the body doesn't want that. So it starts making less of those receptors in response. Go to the next slide, please. That's basically, this first part talks about the downregulation of the receptors. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about cortisol. You'll hear people say folks who are traumatized have higher cortisol levels, stress hormones, and that's actually not accurate. When children are traumatized, you will traumatized children compared to controls. Traumatized children will have higher cortisol levels. But then, if you look at traumatized adults who have a history of childhood trauma, they actually have lower cortisol levels than baseline, though their CRF levels are elevated. And you can go to the next slide. So this was kind of figured out. There's a researcher named Trickett. He wanted to see how do the cortisol levels in girls. He wanted to look at cortisol levels in girls who have been abused and girls who have not and see if there's a difference. And he took 84 girls with confirmed familial sexual abuse and then 89 girls who had not been abused. And he measured their cortisol levels via their saliva at 6 points in time, from the time they were like 5 or 6 until they were 30 years old. And what he found was initially, at the young ages, the girls who were abused had higher cortisol levels than the girls who were not. And then the girls who were abused, their cortisol levels didn't rise throughout life as they normally would have. So they ended up, by the time they were 30, their cortisol levels were less than would be expected. So something happens in adolescence that causes that shift from having high cortisol to low cortisol. Go to the next slide. So these changes, it results in what's called sensitization or priming. The LHPA axis is ready for future threats. So if you take someone who is traumatized and give them an emotional stressor, I guess, you give them emotional stressor, you're going to see elevations in cortisol. And you may see this in your patients who, they have such a dramatic reaction to something that shouldn't cause such a reaction. They're living in the past in their brain. All right, go to the next slide, please. So a couple of factors that affect the LHP axis is, one, the timing and duration of trauma. Basically, we kind of know this clinically. The earlier in life trauma occurs, worse outcomes. If the trauma is physical or sexual in nature versus emotional abuse or neglect, it's going to lead to more changes. And as we age, the pituitary gland gets bigger, just from development. But what we find out is if you take pubertal and post-pubertal kids with PTSD and you measure their pituitary volumes, they're actually larger than they should be, which contribute in the pituitary gland. As it increases in size over life, it increases body fat. And so traumatized kids have larger pituitary glands, which can contribute to obesity we see in these kids. Go to the next. So the CRF elevation that's there through life, it actually occurs even if someone doesn't have symptoms. So there was a study done by a man named Carpenter where he took 50 adults with no diagnosis, right? They were functioning well, they had no anxiety, but they had a history of being traumatized in childhood. And he gave them what's called a Trier stress test, which is experimental test given to invoke anxiety, where someone to administer one, someone would be told, okay, you have a presentation, you have to prepare for it. And they'd get anticipatory anxiety. Then you'd have to give the presentation, and the people would act as if they're rating your presentation with very neutral expression. And then afterwards, you have to do like math problems. So this Trier stress test is used in a lot of social sciences. Well, what he found out is after giving that, the traumatized group, they had actually a lower level of cortisol release than the controls. So what makes this complicated is some studies will show after a trauma, people who have been traumatized, their cortisol levels will rise. Other studies say that they will lower, just to make things complicated. But the trauma is associated with changes in cortisol secretion. Go to the next one. I talked about this briefly, but normally cortisol in our body, it peaks in the morning, and then for the next hour it drops quite precipitously and fast, and then it lowers throughout the day, and then we have our lowest cortisol levels at night. This man named Sacchetti, he wanted to see the change in cortisol through the day, is that impacted by a history of trauma? So he took 265 school-age kids who had been traumatized and 288 who had not, and he measured their salivary cortisol in the morning and then the late afternoon over a period of 5 days. And what he found out is that normal slope downward in cortisol throughout the day, traumatized kids had less of a slope downward. So their cortisol levels in the evening were higher than kids who were not traumatized. Go to the next slide. So the severity of the trauma impacts this system. The types of trauma impact this system. Also, there are gender differences. We had talked about this earlier about why women have higher rates of PTSD. Also, women are overrepresented in studies of trauma. And the reason for that is because a lot of men who are traumatized end up incarcerated, and women are less likely to be incarcerated, so they're easier to study in that sense. And also, antisocial personality disorders associated with lower cortisol levels, and men, when they're exposed to trauma, tend to have more of a decrease in their cortisol than women. So we can go to the next slide. I want to talk briefly about how genetics are involved in this. There's a term called epigenetics, and it's kind of how we think about genetics now in the medical field. Prior, there was the nature-nurture conversation, but that's an old way of thinking about it. It's more how are your genes impacted by your environment? We call that epigenetics because things that occur in our environment can change the expression of our genes. They can turn certain genes on, turn certain genes off. And interestingly, this has been shown in animal models that trauma can be passed down through generations. And I don't just mean this grandpa was abused, right? So he abuses granddaughter, then granddaughter abuses her daughter, and everyone has PTSD. That's not what I'm talking about. It can be transgenerational, where someone can be traumatized, their child not have symptoms of trauma, but then their child can. So it can pass through generations. And this was first described in the 60s with Holocaust survivors. What they found out is children of Holocaust survivors were more likely to have symptoms of PTSD with, relatively minor traumas as compared to the Holocaust. And so trying to figure out why is that. They also found that after the Vietnam War, that if your parent had been in the Vietnam War, you were more likely to have PTSD in your life. And then this kind of was finally, I don't want to say proven, but the best evidence was in the Yom Kippur War with Israel, that the soldiers, after experiencing war, they were more likely to have PTSD if their parent was a Holocaust survivor. So whatever happened to their parents' biology during the Holocaust was transferred to their kids. And I just find that fascinating. Go to the next slide. Okay. But there are things we can do to buffer this LHPA sensitization. Here's a picture of me and my child when he was a baby. I'm trying to help him out, but I don't know if I was successful. But things that can buffer this response include quality child care, and then also CBT. CBT has been shown to normalize cortisol levels in people who have been traumatized, so it's not hopeless. We can help. We'll go to the next slide. All right, so I'm done talking about that. So you guys did good bearing with me with talking about physiology. So now I want to talk about brain development. First, I'll just talk about normal brain development, typical brain development, and then how trauma affects that. Go to the next slide. There's my son, too, reading a book. He wasn't reading it, though. The book is actually a book called The Psychological Birth. What is it? the Psychological Birth of the Human or something like that. It was an analytical book, and I thought it was funny. But anyway, so the brain, it's 2% of our body weight roughly, but it consumes 20% of our body's energy. These numbers don't make sense to me. I can't, make sense of them, but there are 100 billion neurons, and there are 1 trillion glial cells, which are helper cells. And then whatever that number is, 10 to the 15 connections made between brain cells. So go to the next slide. There are several different brain cells, but we'll basically talk about neurons. They send and receive information. And then they have supporter cells, which are called glial cells. The ones most important, I don't want to say most important. There are cells called oligodendrocytes that make what's called myelin, which is fat that goes around the nerve cell. It's to make the nerve cell conduct. And so if you hear in brain, someone saying brain, the white matter in the brain, that's the myelin, that's the fat in the brain. If you hear someone say gray matter in the brain, that's the unmyelinated neurons. So go to the next slide. So when we're in utero, our brains, different parts of our brains develop differently and at different paces. But prior to birth, our brain, we make too many neurons. We don't need all this. So there's an overabundance of neurons being made. And then during childhood, the neurons get bigger. They start making more and more connections. And then starting around late childhood or early adolescence, we start pruning, right? We don't need all these connections. We need to strengthen the connections that are needed and get rid of the ones that aren't. So this explains why if you learn a second language at the age of 4, you can sound like a native speaker. You learn it at 44, you're never going to sound like a native speaker because then the connections aren't there for that. And then overall, throughout your life, your gray matter decreases. Go to the next slide. On a cellular level within your brain, trauma leads to cell death. It causes our oligodendrocytes to not myelinate the neurons well. It shortens our telomeres. Telomeres are like the end caps on our chromosomes that protect our DNA, and every time throughout life they shorten. But if you look at traumatized people, their telomeres are already shorter off the bat. So just want to mention that. Go to the next slide. Okay, this is interesting. What are the gross brain changes made? And by gross, I mean large-scale brain changes as a result of trauma. So we know that people who have experienced trauma have smaller space inside their head. Their intracranial volumes are smaller, roughly 7%. The actual mass of their brain is smaller. Some studies have seen cerebral in adults who have been traumatized. The amount of cerebral tissue is 8% less than would be expected. So trauma causes small brains. And then the longer the duration of the trauma, the smaller your brain will be. And it also is associated with smaller amygdala volumes. And there's a study done in boys that showed that they had larger ventricles in your brain. So in your brain where the cerebral spinal fluid is, it kind of looks like little sacs in there if you were to see it. In traumatized boys, those are larger, which basically means their brain is smaller, and so that space appears bigger. And that's also seen in schizophrenia. All right, so go to the next slide. And this is a wordy slide, but this was a meta-analysis that was done on imaging studies of people who are traumatized to see how much brain loss is there? Can we quantify this? And what they found was, on average, throughout all these studies, some studies showed 100 grams smaller brains, some studies showed 48 grams of less brain tissue, but on average, what we can say is folks who have been traumatized, their brains weigh about 70 grams less than someone's brain who hasn't been traumatized. Go to the next slide. So 70 grams, we don't use the metric system, so it's hard to put that in perspective. So I Googled what weighs around 70 grams, and an egg an egg is about 70 grams. So if you think about that, that's a lot of brain tissue that is actually lost as a result of trauma. 31 pennies, 61 jelly beans, 42 playing cards, or 2 slices of bread. And that kind of helped me think about it. Like, you can imagine maybe putting slices of bread on a brain. Like, that's a lot of brain loss. So, I don't know. I found that amazing. Go to the next slide. I want to talk about catecholamines. Remember, we were talking about the LHPA axis, and we talked about the adrenal gland that releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. So, what's the role of these in childhood trauma? So, for the fight or flight response, that's pretty obvious. We release adrenaline, and we know that kids who have been traumatized have higher levels of catecholamines in their urine, which means that they have higher levels of catecholamine throughout the day. So they're always on edge. The fight or flight is there at all times, and we see that in our patient populations. Go to the next slide. These higher catecholamines in their blood is associated with hypervigilance, threat perception. So this was a study that was done where they took kids who were traumatized and controls again, and they wanted to see how aware traumatized kids were at recognizing changes in emotional expression, right? So they were given, a neutral face, and then several pictures where a face got gradually either happier, more anxious, more scared, or more aggressive. And what they found out is traumatized children were much better able to detect anger in a face than non-traumatized kids. For all of the other emotions, it was the same. There was no difference. But they were able to identify anger much quicker, which is an adaptive response. It's hard to call that pathology, right? It can be life-saving. So, but you can go to the next slide. Whoop, skip this slide. Go to the next slide. If only 2 people had seen The Big Lebowski, I guarantee no one knew where that was from, so we'll just pass that. So we talked about the catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine. Also serotonin is impacted in trauma, and there's my terrible diagram. But at the bottom, in the midbrain, in the green, that's called the Raphe nucleus. That's where serotonergic cell bodies originate, and they project to the cerebral cortex, and then from the cerebral cortex, they project down to the hypothalamus. Serotonin has multiple functions in the body: mood, aggression, cognition, appetite, sleep. And if this system is, I don't want to say miswired, but if this system isn't working appropriately, then, how do I say this? If your serotonergic system isn't functioning properly, you're going to have problems in all of those areas. Mood, cognition, sleep, all of that. And so, go to the next slide. This is a busy slide. I apologize. But what I want to talk about is what's called the serotonin transporter, because this is studied a lot in traumatized folks. So the top thing you're witnessing there, that's a presynaptic neuron, and the yellow thing at the bottom is a postsynaptic neuron. And the serotonin transporter, that's on the presynaptic neuron, and it brings in serotonin serotonin is released, and then serotonin kind of hangs out in that synaptic cleft, and it's brought back into the presynaptic neuron by that transporter, and then it's degraded by an enzyme called monoamine oxidase. Well, each of us have slightly different serotonin transporters. So go to the next slide. An allele is just an alternative form of a gene. So we have there are short alleles, long alleles, and what's been studied in trauma is what's called the short allele, or the serotonin transporter gene. And what we found out is if you have the short allele, but no history of trauma, you tend to be a more resilient person. However, if you have the short allele and experience maltreatment, then you are less resilient. So if you ever see anyone talking about the short allele of the serotonin transporter gene, that's what it is. Go to the next one. Monoamine oxidase, this is inside the presynaptic neuron, and it degrades serotonin, and there are different alleles to that, to the gene that makes that. And having the short allele in the presence of abuse will lead to antisocial behavior, hyperactivity, alcoholism is related with the short allele. And in even women who've been sexually abused and have the short allele are more likely to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder or have alcoholism. All right, go to the next slide. This is almost done. You guys are doing good. So I'm going to talk about oxytocin. People are familiar with that. I think of it as like the bonding hormone, which it does play a role. There's a picture of my wife and children when they were younger. And, but it does more than that. Interestingly, oxytocin, what it does in group, meaning around your social network, your family, people you trust, it's associated with social intimacy, empathy, emotion recognition, attachments, and trust. However, when oxytocin in out-of-group relationships, it actually leads to mistrust, decreased trust, things of that sort. So it's not just a bonding hormone. It helps with bonds if it's in group, but out of group it doesn't. It excludes. So go to the next slide. We'll skip that slide. I'm sure you'll thank me. So this slide shows the sex differences in the release of oxytocin following a traumatic event. So what they found out after giving an experimental stressor, usually the Trier stress test, that traumatized girls had a spike, and that's a spike in oxytocin after the experimental stressors. Boys didn't have that spike, and then kids who weren't traumatized didn't have that spike. So when you think about it, if you traumatize someone, that bonding hormone increases, right? So you wouldn't think that would happen. So go to the next slide. So I think it has something, I think it leads to sexual outcomes later in life. And this study was quite interesting. They wanted to see the impact of trauma on people's sex lives as adults. And so what they did, they took a large group of people and they quantified how many adverse childhood experiences they had. And some people had 0 childhood experiences, and then some people had 4 or more. And so they wanted to look at age of first sexual experience. They considered at age 14 or under to be early sex. And what they found out, interestingly, is having just one adverse childhood experience, your chances of having sex at 14 or under was 2 times greater than people who had not had any traumatic experience. And if you had 4 or more traumatic experiences, you were almost 7 times more likely to have sex before the age of 14 as compared to people who had no history of trauma. As far as sexual promiscuity, they define this as 30 or more sexual partners. And people who had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences were 3.6 times more likely to have 30 or more sexual partners during their life. And then they also asked about people's satisfaction with their sex life. And if you had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, you were twice as likely to be dissatisfied with your sex life. And that may play a role as a result of oxytocin. Go to the next slide. Basically, we'll just leave this slide at trauma causes inflammation in your body. And that inflammation is associated with the intrusive symptoms of PTSD. It leads to poor health outcomes, including higher BMI, higher total cholesterol, lower good cholesterol, and higher hemoglobin A1Cs. And these are problems that can be caused to have an inflammatory basis, and trauma can increase those problems. So, go to the next slide, and I think we're done. There's a lot of references there. I won't bore you with them. So, you guys did pretty good sitting through that. So, I'll open it up to questions if anyone has any, or comments, or have any thoughts on the matter, or things you wonder about, or have observed, whatever it may be. Any questions? So after the trauma and in childhood, your cortisol levels will stay elevated. And then after puberty, your cortisol levels will be lower at baseline. So traumatized adults have lower cortisol levels than non-traumatized adults. However, their CRF levels, the corticotropin releasing factor, that's higher. So yeah, so you actually have less cortisol. Any other? Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.